And welcome everyone to Rock and Radio. Brand new episode here of Dive Cuts. It's season 7. I don't know what episode we're on at this point, but it's just me, your host, Sam Snelling. And today I have another interview. So we're going to talk to Rocco Miller. Rocco is a bracketologist. He's on the bracketeer.org. He's on Twitter at RoccoMiller8, so you can do all the follow things that you have to do there. Rocco and I had a really productive and fun conversation about scheduling, how it impacts the NCAA tournament bids, who's good at it, who's bad at it, and how he feels about Dennis Gates and the Missouri Tigers and their approach to scheduling. So without any further ado, let's get to Rocco Miller. And I'd like to welcome into the podcast, for the very first time, one of my favorite follows on Twitter, or X, as I think we call it now, Rocco Miller from bracketeer.org. Rocco, thanks for joining me, man. I'm really excited about this. We're going to talk non-conference schedules. What's going on with you these days?
Sam, great to be on with you guys. I love the work that you do, and I've followed you all from afar for several seasons now. So it's good to be talking basketball here in the middle of the start of football season. I like where your head's at. What's going on for me these days is, I spend pretty much the entire off season working with programs, leagues, organizers, et cetera, on what makes sense schedule-wise for those specific programs, specific leagues, specific events, and just basically do everything I possibly can to add value to the process. Any kind of opinion sounding board. Sometimes I'm just a sounding board for a team to make a decision with. Other times I'm a little bit more involved where, I kind of like the beginning of the process, more like right after the Final Four, April, May timeframe, where, a lot of these schedules are still getting molded like clay. The portal's still being figured out. This year we had from March 11th to May 11th. And it's really interesting to see behind the scenes all the poker that gets played with scheduling. Games we think are going to happen that don't ever happen. Games that come out of nowhere that do happen. You get a little bit, almost like recruiting, you get a little bit of everything with scheduling and kind of the drama with it. And there's different reasons for different programs. So there's never a one size fits all for the reason a game does happen or doesn't happen. So that leads us now to September, where we still are seeing the last 100 to 150 schedules being announced. There was somewhere around 10. We're recording this on a Wednesday, so there was like 10 or so today. So it's just constantly evolving information. And then once we have all 362 schedules set, kind of getting there now, that's when I'm really going to start diving into my preview mode. I've started to dabble with that early on here as we got out of Labor Day weekend. So that's where I'm at. I'm starting to make that big shift from schedule mode to preview mode.
Yeah, I feel you on the on the preview mode. We at Rock 'Em Nation have been kind of doing these SEC team previews now for the last several years, and it's always really difficult to, especially with an unbalanced schedule in conference, to sort of determine who you think is going to place where in the conference. And so we actually put together like a game-by-game pick'em sheet where we actually have, several people that log in and log picks for every single game the SEC season to try and get some kind of like pecking order. And then only at that point, when I've figured out what I think my pecking order is going to be based upon league record, then I can go back and actually start working on writing those things, which is always a daunting task. So I think you and I are kind of on a similar page where it's just like, ooh, like I'm just about to get going.
No, that's amazing that you guys do that, because I think almost 90% of the forecast you'll read out there, even if they're trying to project an exact record for a team, I don't think they're always looking at it, or rarely even looking at it as a game by game basis. One of the things that drives me nuts and it's not Joe's fault over at ESPN, Joe Lenardi's fault, but it's because he's under tight time constraints, and I'm guessing he might not get the memo till a day before when something needs to be printed. And that's just not enough time. I have all day to do what I do, so I can take 3 or 4 days if I have to get all the necessary ingredients in there. But one thing I take a lot of pride in, especially in my preseason preview portion, is looking very closely at the schedules to try to get some sort of simulation, not just about how talented these rosters are, or how deep these rosters are, how great the coaches are or not so great, but also that third big pillar is who you play and where you play them. And how does that set up for your next game? Do you have like 3 or 4 in a row that are just going to be an insanely brutal stretch, or is it actually like mapped out really beautifully where you can go on a long run of victories, those types of things?
Well, yeah, and I think this actually may come up later as we talk. Also, is like one of the things that I've always sort of appreciated knowing a team schedule and knowing kind of like when you can sort of pick their ebbs and flows. Like it's easy, just looking at the SEC, for example, like a couple of years ago, it was easy to look at Arkansas's non-conference schedule and Arkansas's conference schedule and see very early on that they were going to hit some bumps, and then see things open up later on and sort of watch them kind of go on a run. And sure enough, that's what they did. And everyone's just like, oh, now that they're this great team now and they figured it out. And it's like, well, they also had a really, really tough opening to the conference slate, and asking a team to like go on the road to Kentucky and go on the road and, I can't remember who it was, but like, Florida or Tennessee and win games on the road in league play, consistently is really, really hard, even if you are a top team. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, they were dealt some brutal stretches, I think probably based on their 22 performance. Obviously 2022, they were an Elite Eight team. They were the year before that as well. So they played themselves into this upper echelon forecasting category, which is kind of how scheduling in a lot of leagues, especially the SEC for sure, is based when you have the unbalanced schedule. So there's going to be teams like Arkansas, Kentucky, teams at the top that are going to maybe Missouri.
Yeah, we'll see what happens with Missouri. They're probably somewhere in the middle. I don't think they'll have the easiest schedule, but they probably won't have the hardest either. Finished tied for 4th last year, so that'll be fascinating to see how they do that. There's also like a lot of politicking going on within that as well. Whether it's with the SEC, with the linear television and basically all Power 5. They're fighting for those TV spots. So that could be like, if we think Kentucky, Alabama, or Kentucky, Tennessee, or Kentucky, Arkansas are going to be the highest rated games, they might all just be stuck playing together twice a year just because of that alone. And then you mix in like your Auburns and your Floridas, and then, maybe Missouri's in that next group. Texas A&M is supposed to be really good. So the league's pretty deep this year, at least on paper. So I think it could go a lot of different ways. I know the coaches will think the opposite of the networks, right? So in most cases, and so they'll be fighting to maybe be able to play like a South Carolina twice instead, or perhaps somebody near the bottom.
Right. Well, so one of the things that I did want to sort of, pick your brain on, and so let's kind of approach this in a way of a school like Missouri. So, a team, and not necessarily Missouri in 2022 or in, 2023, but, in general. So a prospective NCAA tournament team, a team with, let's get to the NCAA tournament as our goal, right? What do they need to do in order to make sure that they have a good non-conference schedule that's going to put them in position, kind of getting into league play where they're going to be kind of in that range of a team that's talked about for the tournament?
Yeah, so I think in that general question, so Missouri's in the SEC. I think the league you're in matters a lot. So it's hard to just do like a blind answer to that, because there is a hierarchy within scheduling. So if we believe like the Big 12 is the best league, and then we think the Big 10 is maybe the second best, and then SEC is right there with the Big East for for top three. That's kind of like a good rule of thumb to start basing it off of. And then the Pac-12 and the ACC probably 5 and 6. Again, this is all just forecasting. You want to make sure you have adequate opportunities away from home to impress the committee. So again, Missouri this year, they decided to host a multi-team event with quad 4 teams. So some of their schedule represents an opportunity to just pick up some wins. Like last year, they had 8 quad 4 games. This year, they'll have a good handful as well. But the thing I think that Missouri's schedule specifically this year benefits them is they do have 3 true road games on the non-conference schedule to go along with what will become 9 road games in the SEC. So they'll have a good amount of data on true road performances. And then you will also have, a couple neutral court opportunities. Of course, every year when they play Illinois, that's a huge opportunity against what's more than likely a tournament caliber team. And so those are some great opportunities for them as well. So I think when you're in the SEC, Missouri proved it last year specifically, right, where you don't have to have an Alabama level schedule. Alabama, to me, is probably one of the schools I respect the most in scheduling because they basically just don't play any quad 4s. They make every game count. They figure out a way to get better, and they play some of the best mid-major programs you can find. And it seems to work out for them pretty well, but they also believe in their talent. And Dennis Gates was new just a year ago. So what Dennis Gates is doing right now specifically is very common for a new head coach. Missouri was fortunate to build a great team last year, to be a tournament caliber team, have plenty of wins to back that up. The resume was really strong. It was actually the performance metrics, which you guys talked about a lot, that held them back. But they were clearly in, and I don't think there was much worry about that once we got to a mature part of the season. Whereas like at Minnesota, you have Ben Johnson, who's stuck at the bottom of the Big Ten, really has no choice right now, but you just schedule like 9 or 10 home wins, which is how the Gophers are going about it. And, they actually have Missouri coming in, which is interesting. But, so like in his situation, he's looking at it. That's where it gets really interesting in scheduling, because I would say the majority of programs, especially in Missouri's range, their whole goal is just to make the tournament, and that's what it always should be. But in certain cases where if a coach is worried about getting run off in a 1-year cycle or a 2-year cycle, which is becoming increasingly common, scheduling can be more about job security than it is about a resume. Because at least then if he has 10 home wins and they win 5 or 6 games in the league, he can say, listen, we won 15 or 16 games in my first year. Last year, you guys only won like 11 when they fired the guy before. So you see a lot of that too. So I think if you're really trying to digest this, you got to think about both elements. Yes, most teams, especially Power 6, are doing everything they can to get in. But if you're picked at the bottom of your league, like maybe a DePaul in the Big East or a Minnesota, like I mentioned, or Oregon State out in the Pac-12, you're going to go out and find a bunch of wins to impress your bosses, to at least have something to point at to be back in a year.
Well, so you brought up Alabama, and I think Alabama is a good example of a team that always kind of schedules tough, or at least several years, like unafraid to schedule really tough games. And kind of getting back, I think if you follow me enough, and a lot of the folks here that read Rock Nation know very well, I am by no means an Eric Musselman fan. Personality wise, like he's not my cup of tea, but as far as like how he runs a program and how he schedules, like I really like how he schedules, because all of those home wins that he seems to stack up are all against like these kind of like pretty solid mid-major teams who are going to come in, and teams that are potential league winners. So you're basically stacking up teams who you could maybe see in the NCAA tournament at the end of the year. And I think that approach, where you're scheduling more in the kind of like quad 3 for those home gimme games versus, the quad 4, is kind of like the difference that I've seen. And again, like Dennis Gates is very early in his tenure, and, we can talk about, sort of like what maybe Dennis Gates wants to do down the road, but I think when you're looking at like, there's sort of like this middle ground between, scheduling everybody tough and then making sure that you have your wins, but making sure that like you're getting a challenge and not winning every game by 45 points. So, are there like a group of teams that you're sort of like thinking that schedule the best, and what are the elements that make them so good at scheduling?
Yeah, I some of it is personal fulfillment. When I see an Alabama schedule, for example, like they've had 2 of the last 3 years, I believe, without a quad 4 opponent for 2 of those 3 seasons. And I think last year they ended up with 3 at the end, but it was 1 for most of the year. So the 2 of the 3 were right on the cut of quad 3 and quad 4. I think it's done. I know for sure with Nate Oates' program, just because I've been close with them since Buffalo, it is 100% intentional. And there's the reason I like it so much is if you stack 7 or 8 games against teams that are either picked to win their league or top 3 in their league, one of those types of models, or even a team that's forecasted top 150 net, quad 3, as you mentioned, just for the fans at home, it's a range of teams 76 through 160. Preseason wise, that's hard to thread. But if you go find like your UNC Asheville's, your McNeese's, your South Dakota States, you feel pretty good about that because all those teams this year, for example, are supposed to be very strong and pretty easy picks to win their league. And then go beyond that, there's these historically strong programs you see on like Arkansas's schedule. They have Greensboro. That's a team that is almost always good at the SoCon level. So you can just make these kind of safer bets and know that not only are you going to, if you go 6-1 somehow out of those 7 that are good games, you're going to be fine. You have a million chances later in the SEC to make up for it. And then the benefit is on the basketball end, you're going to probably play. And I know Musselman looks at it this way. I think Oates does too. But they want to see a mix of styles. So if you really crunch the numbers on either of those schedules, I bet you would find that some of those teams are forecasted to play up tempo. Some of them are forecasted to play a very slow, grind you down tempo. And then others might have like elite athletes or an NBA prospect. So I ask a lot of different staffs about this. I haven't asked Alabama or Arkansas specifically, but I always find that pretty fascinating how teams want to go about their schedule from a personnel standpoint. So like Florida Atlantic last year didn't even have a really strong schedule in the end. They also weren't very well publicized in the preseason, unfortunately for them. So they kind of had their limitations, but they purposely wanted Antoine Davis to come down so they could guard an elite NBA level player, do things like that to get ready for a potential run to the NCAA. So I thought just talking to Dusty May about stuff like that was very interesting. And now, of course, this year that school will have unlimited opportunities. They're playing in the Jimmy V against Illinois. They've got Barstool tip-off Loyola Chicago. So everything changed for them. But that is a lot of the strategy as well. And as a basketball purist, I think that's really smart. And I just think a lot of these games you could play at the quad 4 level. A lot of the Power 5 schools, especially if you're picked middle down, kind of like what Missouri did a year ago, and maybe a little bit this year as well. They're basically fighting for the bottom feeders. They're fighting over teams projected 325 to 360. You can even look at UConn. UConn just released their schedule a week or 2 ago, and almost all of their open home dates they filled them with really the bottom of D1. You've got like your Mississippi Valley State in there. You've got your Manhattan. There's some really, really bad teams on UConn's schedule, and I don't necessarily agree with that. Now, again, it might not matter that much because they have so much talent and enough good games. They'll probably be fine. But anyway, trying to come back to your question, I do think teams like Alabama and Arkansas are built to have deeper runs or at least have more exposure to the types of teams they might run into in a first round or second round NCAA setting because of the way they go about it.
Well, so what do you think, like, the fear is, and kind of speaking of, of UConn and playing a team like Mississippi Valley State, and, Lord knows Missouri through the years has had opponents come in that, even in the Kim Anderson years where, I believe one year they had Alabama A&M in, and they one of Kim's worst teams beat him by nearly 50 points. And it's just like, it's hard to, and then there's, I think, Conso Martin, what was a couple years ago, like scheduled the NAIA school. And, like at the time, I think we sort of justified it as like, well, the coach at this NAIA school is also running this AAU program where he's got several kids that Conzo's recruiting. And it's like, all right, so you can kind of make sense of it, but it's still an uncompetitive game. And so like, I realize coaches are out there that, one, they want the gate, and not just the coaches, but the AD, they want the gate.
Yep.
So you want to make sure you have a home date. You want to make sure you have a home win. Some coaches are looking to get kind of young guys experience to make sure that those guys are maybe going to stick around and not dip into the portal. But playing somebody, let's say like Mississippi Valley State, versus, somebody who's regional but also good, but somebody that you should probably still beat by double digits, and let's say just like a Vermont, for like UConn, like what is the disconnect between kind of, I think what maybe fans want to see, which I think, I'm speaking for probably a lot of fans and saying schedule more of games like these as opposed to games like these.
I think it's good that you pointed those things out, because at certain places you do have a quota for home games. You might have to get 8. Some places you have to get 9. I know like 2 of the ones that are not even at the Power 5 level are VCU and New Mexico. Great examples. Their administration requires them to play a heavy load of home games because the gate's super important at those places. New Mexico gets 14,000. VCU has crazy crowds. So that makes sense to me. But outside of like some of those boundaries, it's also interesting. You said the recruiting part that can come up. That also comes up in potential opponents. So a lot of the exercise I do throughout the off season, especially in the middle months, I would say like May through current, is just tracking all the different dates that teams are available. And I could run through a list of, let's just say it is Missouri. I can run through 12 different teams at Missouri, and they might have 12 different reasons why they can't play a certain coach, or this kid used to play for us and transferred from us, so we won't play them. Or, we have some bad blood with these guys, so we won't play them. And then all of a sudden, it won't happen as much at the Power 5. So, Missouri's not the greatest example, but it happens a lot in like that next level, like your Wichita State level, or even your, Mountain West and whatnot, that it's still close to high major, but not in the power ranks. Where I'm just like, guys, if you don't play one of these teams, you're just not going to have anybody to play. And that's pretty ridiculous. And so the stubbornness in scheduling is extremely high. And in reality, a place like Missouri or UConn, of course, you have the ability to play probably up to 200 plus teams if you really want to, before you even have to ever call a Division II or NAIA or any non-Division I. So that to me is mostly illogical, but I get it if there was some sort of tie-in for access to a player or doing a favor for somebody that pays you off down the road or whatever the case may be. But yeah, in general, I think I agree with you. It's silly. It doesn't move the needle. From a bracketology or from a selection committee standpoint, a good rule of thumb is that you would just look at a team's resume without the Q4 or non-D1 results. So what's your record after that? And that's actually been a really good way for me to be really accurate in my own forecasting. It helped me see like Oklahoma State was a great example last year, where when you took away, I'm not looking at it right now, but I know when you took away their Q4, it became pretty clear it'd be difficult to accept them. And on top of the fact that they had 15 overall losses. So, it was a lot of a deal breaker. So their D1 record, I have Oklahoma State pulled up now, was 20-16. That I think is after their NIT results. So apologies for the final record there. But basically they had 5 Q4 wins. And it wasn't like a ton. Mizzou had 8. But that was enough to just say, listen, without Q4, they're basically a 500 or below team. And that's pretty much what it was. And committee talks about that. And it's really hard for them to take a team once they're at 500 or below, once you remove quad 4, unless you just have an overwhelming amount of elite wins, which falls in the quad 1 category, or even the the top half of quad one. So there's a lot of making up for you have to do if you overload on quad four.
Yeah, and kind of sticking on to Oklahoma State, I would also kind of imagine that. I mean, like, how much of a qualifier is it? Because you're essentially getting a large group of some of the best teams in the country who are required to come play you at your home gym, which is automatically going to build in. And again, this kind of gets back into like how the some of like those middle of the ground teams look at scheduling. It's the fact that like we're going to have 8-9 opportunities to beat Baylor, Kansas, Texas, all in our gym. If we can do that a few times, and we're building a resume, versus essentially using your non-conference resume to also give you a leg up in making the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I mean, all of it is important. I think you want to have a mix of damage that you've done away from home, and I think that's why you've seen a skyrocketing over the last few years of neutral court opportunities. The Mountain West teams, the West Coast Conference teams that I live by, and obviously out in the East you have Atlantic 10, American Conference, a lot of good leagues out there. They're all capitalizing on that because something that the committee really likes to see is it wins against teams that are going to be in the tournament and away from home. So even though the neutral court won't matter as much as a true road win, it still matters quite a bit compared to just buying a home win. And so a lot of the coaches have caught on to that. St. Mary's close to me here. They've been in some ways a pioneer, which is funny because if you rewind the clock like 3 years ago, they were one of the worst scheduling teams in the country, and it cost them twice as like last four out. And Randy is an old coach. He's an old dog. I love the guy, but like, man, for 20 years, he was stubborn about that, never got it. And then he finally just bought in, went all in. And now they've got this whole model of, they've got a good amount of money there. So they're able to go out and buy teams to come out and play here, but they matter a lot. They opened the year last year with Oral Roberts, who ended up being a top 40 team. They ended up playing North Texas at home. They played Hofstra. They played New Mexico, Colorado State. They just had this laundry list of teams that all were quality, and they actually dropped two of those games. They lost both the New Mexico and Colorado State games and still landed in the top 10 in the net because some of that was performance-based. Losing close to Houston helped a ton. They knocked off Gonzaga at one point. But by and large, my point is they had all this other – they gave something for the committee to think about besides those two home losses, and because they had just such a deep schedule. So if you're going to be a good team and you feel good about your team going into the year, I think there's no reason to do what they did, or even at SEC level, do what Alabama and Arkansas does, because you might get knocked off 2 or 3 times throughout the year, but you're going to have a bunch of other impressive wins, especially if you're that good. So why not just go for it? It's only going to help you, and it's also going to make your team tougher, because if you play like 3 straight games against Southland, SWAC, and Ohio Valley Conference teams, you're probably not going to get much better. You might learn a little bit more about your bench, but I just don't think that's nearly as valuable.
Well, so you kind of brought up like, why not just go for it? And this is something that also kind of jumped into my head as we were discussing earlier. You kind of mentioned Texas A&M, and I think about it like a couple years ago, Buzz Williams was left out of the tournament and was visibly bothered by it, any interview that he had for like the next 2 or 3 weeks. And maybe beyond that. I think at some point I stopped paying attention, but instead of kind of like learning the lesson of why they were left off, he went back and basically just did the same thing like last fall and had a very, very similar non-conference schedule last season. They performed slightly better. They also performed better in the SEC, which got them into the tournament, but it still put them on, what were they, a 7 seed?
Yeah, I think they ended up getting, am I remembering this right? Did they end up a 7?
I'm trying to remember because they lost to Penn State, right?
They did, yes. So they were a 7. And I thought that was Yeah, so I thought that was an interesting decision by the committee. I in my final projection, I had him a 6. I was really accurate, so it was one of the ones I missed on. And so, yeah, they had an interesting bag of results because they had a home loss to Wofford, and they had a loss to Murray State, which did not age well when they were out in the South Carolina tournament.
Mm-hmm.
And then that whole tournament was funky. They lost to Boise there, but then Boise became a tournament team. I think all 4 games of the first round of that thing were upsets. But I think over the course of an SEC season, they were one of the hottest teams in the country performance-wise. They were more than making up for their blemishes in non-league, and that saved them. But I agree with you. Buzz himself did not do quite anything really different to make up for it. Their non-conference strength of schedule as of Selection Sunday last year was number 260, and that's okay for selection. Typically, once you go above 300, you're starting to get really at risk. In fact, if you go like above 320, you can ask Wake Forest 2 years ago or Clemson last year. They were almost de facto eliminated before the ACC tournament. In my view, it would be unprecedented to select those 2 teams because I think Clemson was 341, and then Wake Forest might have been identically 341 the year before. And both those coaches were very upset, right? So it's kind of the same thing. So you got to be really careful to not build so many wins that you land in that situation. You also, I try to talk to coaches about this. I just don't know how much at the SEC level they care. I do work with a couple of SEC coaches pretty closely, but they all came from mid-major schools, so you can probably guess who they are. And so they think more like me, but I think some of the Buzz Williams types, let's just say, they might overlook games just trying to get wins. I think what you want to do is beyond that, like get yourself a team. If you're playing November games, play some teams that are high upside teams because you can win. You can feel good about getting the win early in the year and then watch that team like blossom later. And that win could actually go from a Q4 to a Q3, just based on all their upside. I'm always looking for teams like that to help these guys out. But some of these like the A&M thing, I just don't think it was that strategic.
So then I think the last thing that I kind of wanted to pick your brain about is the guy that I cover and talk about a lot. That's Dennis Gates.
Yep.
So we've now had 2 non-conference schedules under Dennis Gates. The first one was cupcake heavy. It was very, very, very much loaded towards getting W's. Some of that, does make sense. Like I understand, like some limitations when you have built-in contests against Illinois and now a built-in contest against, Kansas. Every year you're playing arguably one of the, top 3 or 4 programs in the country. And a team that, at this point, the last several years, expects to kind of be at top 25 level. So those are automatically going to be onto your schedule. I think like Dennis Gates basically took last year's blueprint and upgraded it a little bit.
Yeah.
Like there's still some, there's just, still a lot of meat on the bone. When you are like, you mentioned the MTE, the multi-team event with Jackson State and South Carolina State. They added Loyola of Maryland, and they added Central Arkansas, which were some of the dates that I think, prior to their schedule release, we were still not sure about. Seton Hall, solid program, still kind of building under Shaheen Holloway. Minnesota, they're having a tough go under Ben Johnson. So what's your general take on Dennis and his scheduling here, at least in year 2?
Yeah, no, I thought it was a step forward, certainly from last year. And coming off of a tournament year, the options were probably there, or they certainly were there to be in a better event that would have added even more challenges to the schedule. the nice thing he did is, they had Memphis locked in, Wichita, now there's Seton Hall in that mix. And you got the 3 road games, thanks to the recently introduced ACC SEC Challenge, going to Pitt. That's a nice road game, probably middle of the pack ACC level, at least on paper. You got the road game at Kansas, which is just all upside. Just you would hope to not lose by a lot to ruin your net or anything like that. And then you've got a manageable road game at Minnesota. I think that was intentionally done because Minnesota is forecasted 15th out of 15 Big Ten teams. 14th out of 14 Big Ten teams, and they could easily be out of Q3 if everything falls apart there. So I don't know if that's very strategic at all, but you would hope if you believe in Ben Johnson and you believe in some of the guys they picked up, maybe they play their way up to like 10th or 9th. A lot wasn't expected of Mizzou last year, right? So Minnesota could do something similar. We don't know. And if that happens, that quickly becomes a nice little Q2 game, right? And everybody would be really happy with it. The Illinois game, as we know, is a big one in neutral court. So that potentially gives you 7 out of the 13 being what I would call strategic games or meaningful games. The five home games with Central Arkansas, Loyola Maryland, Arkansas Pine Bluff, the 2 event games that we've talked about, Jackson State and South Carolina State. Those are certainly going to almost guaranteed to land in quad 4. And then there was also, the other thing I should mention is I think there was an option to extend the series with Liberty, who's going to be picked probably to win Conference USA, which and they're probably forecasted in the 90s. That would have been a nice little resume game. Didn't get played. I'm guessing Mizzou didn't want to do it this year. And, so there was opportunities to continue going forward. I would just say, like, on the positive side, it's certainly a step forward. The amount of home, what we call guarantee games that Missouri has is pretty much par for the course, in SEC level, Big Ten level, Big 12 level, Power 5 as a whole level. So I don't have too big of an issue with it. I am really pleased to see them play 3 true road games. Some of that is fortunate through the challenge. And of course, going to Minnesota. But in general, those 3 true road games, as sad as it sounds, that might end up leading the entire conference in true road games for non-conference.
So then what do you think, sort of projecting ahead, if, Dennis Gates needs to do in year 3, 4, and 5 to sort of make sure that, he can kind of take what, I think we agree is like a step forward and kind of keep taking those steps forward to, like swapping out, Central Arkansas, you're not playing them. Now you're playing, like what level of program do you think needs to sort of to bump it up into the upper echelon of the league?
Yeah, the interesting part of that question is that comes back to basketball. So it's like if Missouri goes out this year, has another great year, gets to the tournament again, maybe even goes a step further in the tournament, that starts to change things, right? Because then that might influx next year's roster. Next year's roster will be the determination on how much they want to do schedule-wise. If it goes the other way and guys defect, you could always come back to more of a schedule like last year. And so, what coaches are thinking about in scheduling, and this is what helps me forecast the season, in fact, is how good somebody's going to be next year. They're not worried about as much what they did the year before. I feel like coaches that are looking at last year are not very modern because these rosters change in a hurry. We'll probably end up with 2-3 new coaches every single year on average in every league. So there's a whole reset that happens once we get to March and scheduling begins. And so for them to crank it up to the next level, it's going to require another good season. And more importantly, I would say an even stronger roster that Coach Gates and the staff feels great about, and they want to go play a more national branded schedule with some big opportunities. And also, like Florida Atlantic example is perfect for this conversation because, like I said, Florida Atlantic struggled to get games last year. Not enough people knew about them. Then they go and do what they did. Now this year, the Jimmy V calls them. Barstool Invitational calls them. They've got the ESPN event down in Orlando, which I was blown away by. They used to have, up until this year, a Metro Atlantic Conference representative, because I believe the Metro Atlantic sponsors that tournament at Disney World. They basically booted them as an 8th team to make sure Florida Atlantic had a spot. So if you end up becoming kind of that next big time cool kid on the block, they're gonna the opportunities are gonna be coming to you first, and that drastically can change your schedule organically. Like I talk to Florida Atlantic all the time, and they were like, "Yeah, Rocco, like 12 of our games were spoken for because we just couldn't say no to those opportunities. It means so much to our program." And again, Mizzou's already a big school, and they've already been there before. But like, I think you know what I'm getting at. As your program continues to build and advance, the schedule can only get you more opportunities as you go.
Yeah, and then I think I would also sort of kind of piggyback onto that, and feel free to kind of chime in as well. Like, with the transfer portal coming into play, so much more roster turnover, so much more coaching turnover, the expansion of leagues. Like the SEC next year is going to have Texas and Oklahoma.
Right.
And really, like, beyond that, who knows? Like, we know Florida State's flirting with everybody to try to get out of the ACC.
Yeah.
Like at some point, like, there are going to be like several programs who are just going to have to like basically understand, like, yeah, like maybe we can have a good year here and there, but these leagues are so deep that, like, how are we gonna sort of sort the middle? And it's going to come down to, and I think it's this way in the SEC now. It's like it's going to come down to, like, can you pick up, that road win at Ole Miss, or can make sure you don't lose a home game against South Carolina, and that's how you go from. And I think this is basically what Missouri did last year. That's how they went from probably being like 9th to being 4th. Is just a couple, Dree Golston, threes at the buzzer, and a very different season if he doesn't make those 2 threes.
Yeah, and it's crazy too, because I have the privilege of following all 32 leagues as closely as possible. Now, obviously, as we get closer to March, I'm locked into more of the at-large picture, but so many of these games, I mean, almost every one of those leagues, they're won on the margins. We have a couple exceptions, like Colgate's typically the best Patriot team. I think South Dakota State will be great in the Summit League, but I mean, the margins in college basketball are so slim. And even when you see, a top team from, Houston came out of the American and Gonzaga comes out of the West Coast, like those teams were nationally recognized and capable of winning the title. So it's a crazy sport in that regard, because Missouri made their resume by that huge road win at Tennessee. You had the Illinois bragging rights win. And then you even collected like 4 great home wins that ended up mattering quite a bit, because they were all against tournament teams. There might have been more than 4, but the last time I updated my chart here that I'm looking at, you had the Kentucky, Arkansas, Iowa State, thanks to the Big 12 SEC Challenge, and Mississippi State as tournament caliber home wins. And a big deal to the committee is getting how did you do against teams in the field? And at that point in time, I think this is up to date as the season ended. Missouri was 6-7, but those 6 wins, when there was nobody even on the bubble with 6 wins except for Michigan, but Michigan had 17 chances, and Missouri only had 13. So it starts to make those decisions a lot easier when you get those big wins.
Yeah.
But you're right. Like, you start taking rough road losses, or especially a home loss like a South Carolina of last year's status. Those can really throw things off, and you have to kind of relook at everything. But you're 100% right. Like, it makes every game important. It really does. And I think that's why we love it.
Well, Rocco, we've gone well over, and I always worry that this is going to happen, mainly because you just start talking basketball, and things get away from you sometimes. I don't know. I'm assuming you're a lot like I am in that regard. I don't think we ever recorded a podcast under an hour, but it's like we always shoot for it. So everybody, you can read this guy's stuff. I always forget which direction to point to. This guy's stuff. You can follow him on X/Twitter, whatever they're calling it these days, at RoccoMiller8. And the Bracketeer.org. I use that site a lot. The non-conference schedules, keeping it up to date, is always super helpful. Great follow on Twitter as well. So everybody go follow them. Guy, anything else you need to plug before we get out of here?
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's bracketeer.org is the website. And like you said, Rocco Miller8 on Twitter is the best place to follow. Fired up to get some of this preview stuff out, and we'll continue adding more leagues to the schedule pages as we get closer.
Sweet. All right. Well, Rocco, thanks so much. We'll be following along this season, and hopefully we'll get to have you on again in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you. Appreciate it, guys.
Thanks. Once again, I'd like to thank Rocco Miller for joining me. It was a really, really insightful discussion. I appreciate all the information you provided. Hope you did too. If you are first time here finding us just now, make sure that you click on that subscribe button. You can also like the video. And that sort of helps bring people to our channel, to our feed, and they can watch me. They can see Kid A, me, Jim, the background, and E.H. Taylor, and all that kind of stuff. Follow Rocco on Twitter, at Rocco Miller, ROCCOMILLER 8, number 8, bracketeer.org. Bookmark it, check it out. It's really good information. And we'll be back in maybe next week. Maybe we'll bring one of the Mats back. Maybe we'll talk to somebody else. I don't know. Still working it out. But until then, thanks for everybody for tuning in, and we will see you later. Bye.